So Nirmal,
Okay.
how's your life nowadays in DC? Can you go out or are you still under lockdown?
It's still a lockdown, but in the US, the lockdown is not as extreme as in other countries. There's still people go out. You can go to the store. There are people going out to the parks. You can still catch a flight somewhere if you want to. But more and more people are wearing masks. Now you cannot go into the store without a mask. Of course, there's no point traveling because you can't actually meet anyone. So I'm kind of stuck in DC, but I do go out every day for exercise, a couple of hours walk, a few miles, just to get out.
Yes.
And how do you do your work? I mean, as journalists, you need to talk to people, get information. So you do that from home, right?
Yes, and I've been doing that from home for a number of years, so that's not a problem for me. I'm quite used to it. But now, of course, one is more reliant on things like Zoom and other sort of teleconferencing.
Mm-hmm. And what about other states in the
platforms.
US?
Across the different states now, you have, of course, New York is in bad shape. You have other states which are trying to open up because there is so much pressure, both in terms of the economy and that is tied up with politics. So you have some states like Florida, for example, Georgia, for example, who are trying to open up a little bit. But there's this great worry that it's happening prematurely, not according to the White House guidelines. And the White House guideline is that you must have 14 days of a continuous decline in hospitalizations in order to start allowing normal activity. A lot of these states are not waiting for that because, there are people who want to get back to work. So there's a real fear that this virus will rebound, gain traction again in some places.
Yeah. And what about public sentiment toward reopening many states, Nirmal? Because from what I heard is many states would like to reopen, but the situation is quite unclear.
Yeah, there is. The polls show that most Americans would prefer avoiding reopening. But in practical terms, there are a lot of Americans, I mean, a large number, who basically live paycheck to paycheck, day by day. And the economic damage is so severe that a lot of people are basically running out of money. There is some pressure to reopen from mostly, I should say, sort of right-wing conservative groups, which who might, for some reason or the other, reasons of their own beliefs or something, not even believe that this virus is a real thing or believe that it only affects minorities, like African Americans, for example, doesn't affect children. They might believe all this, and they're coming out and putting pressure on state governments to open up.
And
as you know, Nirmal, the director of the World Health Organization has cautioned against the pandemic being politicized, but that is exactly what is happening in the U.S. And as a journalist, how do you, see this thing play out? The politicization of the pandemic, of course, with Trump from the top, pointing fingers at his political opponents and trying to deflect blame from himself.
Absolutely, as you said, absolutely. And another thing is that China is going to be a big part of the campaign. Obviously, blaming China. And President Trump, of course, says he acted early, which he did. But subsequently, there were mess-ups and they lost almost an entire month in terms of testing and surveillance and all that. So now there is this effort, all-out effort, I should say, to blame China. And the thing is, the opposition, the Democratic Party and Joe Biden is also blaming China. So blaming China is going to be a campaign issue, and everybody is jumping on that bandwagon. So that is a serious problem.
But how do you think this will play on the sentiments of the American voter? Do they really believe that what Trump say is true, that China is the real cause of this thing, and he wants to hold China accountable for what happened?
So there is a sort of widespread belief that China is to blame and should be held accountable. But if you look at the electorate, it's sort of divided and sliced up. Now, President Trump's base is rock solid. Whatever he does, it will not change. It's I should say it's almost, people don't like it when you say that, but I should say it's almost like cult-like loyalty. So that core remains the same. Democrats, the election eventually is going to be a referendum on, of course, President Trump. So, and it's so personality driven that, again, his support base remains rock solid. Democrats will vote against him. Whoever their candidate is, they will vote against Trump. The key thing is a narrow band of independent voters. Which way will they swing? And the key thing is just 5 or 6 states in the Midwest, where if they come out in support of President Trump, he might win like he did in 2016.
And what about the popularity of Joe Biden? Because it seems that his popularity has risen just recently because of COVID-19. What's the sentiment over there?
Yeah, so polls show consistently that Joe Biden would beat President Trump in a head-to-head now, if the election was held now, but it is a narrow lead, and the polls were wrong in 2016. So I think it's absolutely a toss-up.
Yeah, so we never know.
Nirmal, I'm sure that you must have a lot of American media friends, right? How do they feel, I mean, to see all those press conferences that Trump has held often end up being a confrontation between him and the media?
Yeah, this is there's a lot of irony wrapped up in that. President Trump is actually right when he needles the media saying, you need me for your ratings. This is all very good for ratings. Politics has become like entertainment. For serious journalists, I mean, there is, as we all know actually in the profession, there is a certain sort of depressing element to it, because you have to plow through a sort of miasma of propaganda and falsehoods, and the credibility of the credible media has actually been very successfully eroded. But President Trump, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Erdogan. So I mean it's challenging to say the least.
Nirmal, so far, do you see any changes among American publics after COVID-19? Has America changed at all? What's your observation?
I think it has brought out divisions. It is, I don't think it has changed, but it has exposed divisions. Now, if you look, for example, at Washington, D.C., 81% of mortalities from COVID-19 in Washington, D.C. are among Black Americans. Why is that the case? It's because African Americans have more underlying conditions, diabetes, hypertension, the whole works. I mean, this is all well documented. But when something like this comes along, it becomes very stark. And then you have, again, you have the same political divisions. You have, extreme right-wing groups who believe in conspiracy theories, who believe this is a weapon which has escaped from a lab, or that China exported it deliberately. All wild speculation, but they believe it. So a lot of the political divisions and the underlying ethnic divisions have been exacerbated by this.
I see. So you mean the pandemic has further widened the political divide among Americans, who have already been, heavily politically polarized already? Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, one would have thought that there would be sort of some kind of unity, and there is to some degree. I mean, ordinary Americans, people are cooperating on the street. There's nothing bad happening on the streets. Except, I should say, there is a lot of growing prejudice against Chinese Americans, or anyone who looks Chinese, So that is a problem. That is a serious problem we have to watch, and one is concerned about that. But COVID-19 has actually exacerbated divisions, one has to say.
And Nirmal, you are from India. How has you been following the situation in India, because it's under lockdown as well? How does your family, your relatives cope with the situation?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, they have no choice but to cope. But yeah, the Indian lockdown is way more serious than anything in America. I mean, there are no flights at all. So I have friends whose families are stuck in various cities and have not seen each other for a month. So it is very tough over there, and it's been very unfortunate for the migrant workers, and that's received a lot of media coverage, of course. Extremely tough for migrant workers. It has not been efficiently. It was very draconian, but it was not done in a very efficient and thoughtful manner, the lockdown.
And when
Okay.
when talking about America, Nirmal, you arrived there in last election, 2016. Right now, what about Americans' dream? Is it still exist? Does it still exist with American dream? How do you see it?
I think it is being eroded. If you look at, well, there's one interesting aspect to this, the temporary banning of issuance of green cards, for example. So this is being seen, and it probably is, the anti-immigration. There have been very fundamental changes in America, and if President Trump wins a second term, which again, 50-50 chance, I would say off the top of my head, then these changes will be solidified. For one thing, the Republicans are packing the judiciary with their own nominees. So the court system is going to shift towards the conservatives. So you can expect a lot of basically decisions with conservative bias coming in. So there are fundamental changes afoot. That's why this election is so important.
Nirmal, you notice rising of xenophobic feelings among Americans as a result of this pandemic, and with Trump pointing his finger at China.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, if you look at the, I follow some of the blogs and some of the social media, and there is a rise in xenophobia, especially again against Chinese Americans. That is often conflated as Asian Americans. A lot of people don't know the difference, right? So that is a problem. I mean, you won't find that in cosmopolitan city centers, but even there have been instances. In New York, there have been instances of bullying and discrimination and attacks against Chinese Americans. So it's very unfortunate.
Yeah.
And we know that the base of President Trump is Middle America. Can you tell us what's the sentiment of people over there toward President Trump? Are they still very loyal under COVID-19 situation?
They are still very loyal, I would say, but they're not. The people I have met in the Midwest, in states like Iowa and others, I've met farmers out there. They're not. There's not blind loyalty. If a candidate comes along with policies that make sense to the big farm, to big ag out there, then they would, possibly switch. But still, he has a base which is narrow, but blindly loyal. I mean, his base is 96. He has 96% support in the Republican Party. The Republican Party is in the palm of his hand, right? Nobody can afford to criticize him because he goes after them. So he can destroy you if you criticize him publicly. He goes after you immediately. His preferred method of defense is attack, basically. So his base is blindly loyal. There are some who would, change in swing states like Iowa, for example. Not that many electoral votes, but it has gone back and forth between Democrats and Republicans in recent years. People in some of those states could change, but then the Democrats don't have a policy platform which appeals to them yet. Frankly, they don't. They're struggling as well.
So I'm sure that Trump's political fate in the election at the end of the year depends heavily on how well he manages to contain the pandemic. I'm sure that's the case, right?
Absolutely true. Absolutely true. And right now, frankly, it's not looking good because you must have seen the reporting. The New York Times has found, this internal assessment that the death toll could actually double within 3 or 4 weeks. And if this sort of continues and the economy starts limping along, it doesn't recover properly, then it's in serious trouble.
We know that the American media are also, heavily divided. But what is the general tone of the media coverage of Trump's performance in dealing with the crisis?
Yeah, well, that's what you said. It's just extremely divided. If you listen to, say, a conservative outlet like Fox News, it's an amplifier for President Trump. If you listen to other big networks who are against President Trump, he can do nothing right. So you have a very small handful, actually, of media left. Maybe National Public Radio, maybe, ironically, Voice of America, which has also been attacked by the Trump administration. Some of these outlets remain reliable, and they just do a professional job, unbiased. Of course, some of the big newspapers, President Trump attacks the Washington Post and the New York Times regularly, and it is true that they have been extremely critical of President Trump. But it's a very, very difficult media environment to navigate because of these built-in biases. And that's how the American media is, as we know. And, they're entitled to their biases, but it makes everybody's life difficult. And it doesn't do much for the media's credibility in public eyes. And the media's credibility is a bit low.
And what about business groups? Because we know that they are very influential as well in American politics. What's the sentiment of business groups, associations? Do they still support President Trump, or what's the sentiment nowadays?
I think a lot of big business does support President Trump's in terms of policies. They did not like the fact that he started a trade war with China, but they did acknowledge that it was time somebody stands up to China for its questionable trade practices. And I think they were quite pleased that President Trump apparently got results. He got the new USMCA done with Canada and Mexico. So there have been some good developments on the economy, and they were quite happy with that.
Wow. So it means that right now the country is quite deeply divided, even worse because of COVID-19.
Yes, absolutely. Very divided.